The night Jack Morgan found her, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees and the fog was so thick it swallowed headlights whole. He almost didn't stop. A man like Jack, 45 years old, 2 combat tours behind him, and enough scars to map a war, had learned a long time ago that stopping was how you got killed. The road was safer when you kept moving. The dark was safer when you didn't look too hard into it. But something inside that abandoned barn was crying, and the sound was too small, too broken, too desperate to ignore. What Jack Morgan found inside that rotting structure on the edge of Route 9 would change everything he thought he knew about himself, and pull him directly into the path of a man who had been waiting years for a reason to destroy him. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous protectors are the ones the world gave up on, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like if this story hits you, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I want to know where home is for you. This is the Iron Promise. The Harley moved through the fog like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt anything. Jack Morgan rode with both hands loose on the grips, not because he was relaxed, but because after 23 years on a motorcycle, tension was a waste of energy he didn't have anymore. His gray beard collected moisture from the air. His leather vest, the one with the iron wolves patch that he no longer wore on club runs but couldn't bring himself to take off, pressed against the thermal layer beneath it like a second skin. The engine was the only sound that existed in the world, a low, rolling growl that bounced off the tree line and came back quieter than it left, swallowed by all that white nothing. Route 9 through Harlan County was not a road most people took after dark in November. It curved through abandoned farmland and second-growth forest, past boarded-up feed stores and collapsing fence lines that hadn't held cattle in 30 years. There were no gas stations for 11 miles in either direction. No cell signal worth mentioning. The kind of road that existed in between things. Between towns, between lives, between the version of yourself you used to be and the one you were still trying to figure out. Jack knew roads like this the way other men knew their living rooms. He had been riding for 4 hours out of habit more than intention. Sleep had stopped coming easy around the time his last deployment ended, and that was 7 years ago now. When the walls of his safe house up in the Cedar Hills started pressing in, when the silence got too loud, which was its own particular kind of insanity, he rode. He didn't have a destination. He just needed the cold air and the engine noise to push the other sounds out of his head, the ones that lived in the place behind his eyes where the dark collected. He was 3 miles past the Ketterman farm turnoff when he heard it. It was barely anything. A sound so faint he might have convinced himself it was the wind working through a gap in some old roof, or an animal caught somewhere it shouldn't be. He had ridden another 100 yards before his hands responded to something his conscious brain hadn't fully processed yet. The brakes went on. The bike slowed. He sat in the fog with the engine idling, the white exhaust curling up into the white air, and he listened. There it was again. Not wind, not animal. A child. Jack sat there for 10 full seconds. A man who had learned the hard way that compassion could be used as bait. A man who had ridden toward sounds in other countries and found things that couldn't be unseen. His jaw worked beneath the beard, and he looked at the dark shape of the barn set back maybe 40 yards from the road, barely visible through the fog, its outline soft and rotting and wrong in the way that abandoned structures got when nature started winning them back. He killed the engine. The silence that replaced it was the loudest silence he had heard in years. He got off the bike with the kind of quiet that combat teaches you. Not theatrical, just efficient, each movement placed with intention. He didn't reach for the flashlight on his belt right away. He stood at the road's edge and let his eyes adjust, and he listened with his whole body the way his first sergeant had taught him back when he was 22 and everything still felt survivable. The sound came again. Thin and ragged and desperate. Jack crossed the field. The barn door was not locked. It had not been locked in probably a decade, the hasp hanging loose from rotted wood, the door itself pulled to but not seated in its frame. He pushed it with 2 fingers and it swung inward on hinges that screamed rust into the silence. He stepped inside and clicked the flashlight on, keeping it angled low, not wanting to blind whatever was in here if it was something that could be blinded. The beam found old straw, a collapsed stall, the skeleton of a piece of farm equipment that had not moved since the Clinton administration. bat droppings, and the smell of slow rot and animal musk and something else, something human, unwashed and cold and frightened. "Hello," Jack said. His voice came out rougher than intended. It usually did. He cleared his throat. "I'm not going to hurt you. I heard you from the road." Silence. He moved the beams slowly, checked the corners. The stall furthest from the door was intact, its boards still solid, and in the far corner of that stall, behind a feed trough that had splintered along its seam, there was a shape too small to be anything but what he already suspected. "I can see where you are," he said. "You don't have to come out, but I need you to tell me you're okay." No answer. He crouched down at the entrance to the stall. At this level, with the flashlight tilted so it threw light off the wall rather than directly, he could see her, a little girl, 5 years old, maybe 6. He wasn't good at guessing ages. Never had been. She was wearing a dress that was completely wrong for November in Harlan County, pale yellow cotton with a smocking pattern across the chest, the kind of thing a child wore to a birthday party or a Sunday afternoon somewhere warm. No coat. No shoes that he could see. She had her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and she was watching him with eyes that were doing the thing eyes did when a person was past the point of ordinary fear and had crossed into some territory he recognized from the field. The place where the body just keeps going because stopping means dying. She was shaking so hard he could see it from 6 feet away. "My name is Jack," he said. He sat down in the straw so he was lower than she was, so she was looking down at him rather than up. He'd learned that one from somewhere he couldn't remember. Maybe a pamphlet. Maybe watching someone else do it right once. "I ride a motorcycle. I was just going home." The girl stared at him. "You don't have to talk," he said. "But you're real cold and I've got a jacket." She stared. He unzipped his leather vest and then the thermal beneath it, and then he reached for the flannel shirt underneath that, which he balled up without ceremony and set at the edge of the stall where she could reach it if she wanted. He put the vest back on over bare skin and did not react to the cold, though it hit him like a flat hand. "That's yours if you want it," he said. Another silence. Then very slowly, a small hand reached out and pulled the flannel into the darkness. He waited. He was good at waiting. Patience was one of the few things the years had given him without taking anything in return. When she spoke, her voice was barely there. Scraped thin and dry, the voice of someone who had been crying a long time before he arrived. "If you don't take me," she said, "I won't survive the night." Jack Morgan had been in situations that other men used the word terrifying to describe. He had been in places where survival was a mathematical problem with no clean solution. He had made decisions that he still replayed in the 3 a.m. dark when the silence got too loud. He had heard things that didn't leave him. Those 5 words joined the list immediately, not because they were dramatic, because they were stated. Flat and direct, the way a child spoke when she had been in the situation long enough to understand it completely and had stopped pretending otherwise. He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Then I'll take you." He didn't ask her name yet. He didn't ask where she came from or where her parents were or how she had gotten into an abandoned barn in November, wearing a summer dress with no shoes on. He did not do any of the things that a person was supposed to do in this situation, the things that would have required him to sit still while a child got colder. He just stood up slowly, making sure she could see every movement, and he held out his hand. She looked at the hand for a long time. Then she took it. Her fingers were so cold they felt like something carved rather than living, and when they closed around 2 of his fingers, she couldn't span his whole hand, not even close. Something happened in Jack Morgan's chest that he did not have words for and was not going to examine right now because there was work to do. He carried her out of the barn, wrapped in his arms with the leather vest zipped around both of them as much as it could reach. She weighed almost nothing. She didn't make a sound. She pressed her face into the side of his neck, and he felt the cold of her skin and the warmth of her breath, both at once, and he walked to his bike and stopped and looked at it and made a series of rapid mental calculations. The nearest hospital was in Cloverfield, 32 miles north. He was not taking this child to a hospital tonight. He knew, with a certainty he could not have explained to anyone, that whatever had put her in that barn was not going to be solved by a waiting room and a social worker and a set of questions she wasn't ready to answer. He had seen what institutions did to people who came to them broken. He had watched the machinery of official help grind what was left of a person into a shape that fit the paperwork. He was not doing that to her. Not tonight. His safe house was 14 miles southeast, Cedar Hills, private road, 3 acres of nothing around it in every direction. He had a working furnace, a generator, food, and a first aid kit that would pass muster in a rural clinic. He settled her in front of him on the bike, one arm across her like a bar, the engine barely louder than a running stream when he coaxed it back onto the road. He kept the speed down, kept the corners soft. She did not react to the bike, not with fear or excitement, just held his forearm with both hands and watched the fog move around them like she was watching the world from somewhere far away. Her name, she told him when they were halfway to the Cedar Hills, was Lily. Lily Harper. She was 5 years old. Her grandmother Ruth had told her to run if anything ever happened, and something had happened, and she had run for a long time before she couldn't run anymore. And then she had found the barn, and then he had found her. She said all of this without inflection, the way a child reported facts about the world. It is raining, the barn was cold, you found me. And then she put her face back against his arm and didn't say anything else. Jack turned onto the private road that led up through the cedar trees and felt the weight of those facts settling into him. Lily Harper. Grandmother Ruth. Something had happened. He did not press. He had learned that pressing was how you got a lid, not an opening. Truth came when it was ready, not when you demanded it. The safe house sat at the end of the road, tucked between 2 big cedars with the porch light burning amber against the fog. Jack had owned this place for 11 years. Bought it with money he didn't talk about from a period of his life he talked about even less. It was not much to look at. A 2-story farmhouse that had been solidly built in 1962 and had been maintained with function rather than aesthetics in mind. The floors were hardwood and the heating worked and the windows sealed against the wind. There was a spare room with a bed in it that had not been slept in since he could remember. He carried Lily inside. The warmth hit them both, and she made a sound against his shoulder, small and involuntary, the sound of a body remembering what it felt like not to be cold. He set her on the couch and went immediately for the blankets he kept in the cedar chest by the fireplace, stacking them around her until only her face showed. Then he went to the kitchen and put water on for something warm and tried not to think too hard about what came next. When he came back with a mug of warm broth, he wasn't sure she could handle anything more substantial, not yet. He stopped in the doorway because Lily Harper was sitting up straight in the pile of blankets and looking at his walls. Jack's walls were not the walls of a man who had been living peacefully. There were maps, old ones, annotated in his handwriting. There were photographs, some of men he had served with, some of places he had rather not remember but couldn't stop looking at. There was a shelf of books that leaned against each other like they were tired, and there was hanging above the fireplace on 2 hooks a shotgun that had not been fired in 3 years but was always loaded. Lily was looking at the shotgun. "That's not for you," Jack said. His voice came out rougher again. He crossed to the couch and crouched to her level and held out the mug. "You drink this. It'll warm you from the inside." She took the mug in both hands and held it and looked at him over the rim. "Are you going to call someone?" she asked. He looked at her. "Not tonight." "Ruth said not to call anyone." "Then we won't." She held his gaze for a moment. This 5-year-old, this child who had run through the dark and the cold and ended up in a barn and had still, somehow, managed to assess the situation accurately enough to tell a stranger he was her only option. Something behind her eyes was older than her face suggested, and he recognized that too because he had seen it in the mirror. She drank the broth. Jack sat on the coffee table across from her, his boots on the hardwood floor, his elbows on his knees, and waited while she drank. The house creaked in the wind. The furnace kicked on with a sound like a deep breath. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows and the cedar trees moved their branches in the dark. When the mug was empty, she held it out to him with both hands, formal and careful, and he took it. "Thank you," she said. Like she'd been taught, like manners were something she applied even in the ruins. He put the mug on the table beside him and did not say "you're welcome" because it felt wrong, felt insufficient, felt like a phrase that belonged to a different world than the one they were currently sitting in. "Lily," he said, "the bruises on your arms." Her hands disappeared into the blanket immediately. Reflex. Pure and practiced, the kind of response a body developed when it had learned that drawing attention to an injury made things worse. Jack filed that away, said nothing else about it. "You're going to sleep in the room upstairs tonight," he said. "Door locks from the inside. You have the key." He produced it from his pocket. He'd taken it off the hook in the kitchen before he'd even thought about why. "Nobody comes in unless you say so." She looked at the key. "What about you?" she said. "I'll be down here." "Why?" He considered the question. "Because you don't know me yet," he said, "and you shouldn't trust someone just because they were in the right place." Lily Harper looked at him for a long time with those eyes that had seen too much. "You came back for the flannel shirt," she said. "I left it for you." "You came back for me," she said, like she was correcting him, like this was an important distinction. Jack opened his mouth and didn't have an answer for that because she was right, and they both knew it. He walked her upstairs. He showed her the bathroom with the working lock and the towels that were clean. He showed her the spare room with the bed that had been made up since he didn't know when, out of habit or stubbornness. He stood in the doorway while she climbed into the bed with the blanket still wrapped around her, and he turned on the lamp on the nightstand and turned off the overhead light, because the overhead light was harsh, and she'd had enough harsh. "Keys on the nightstand," he said. She reached out and put her hand on it. "Jack?" she said. "Yeah." "There's a man?" she said. "I don't know his name, but he scared Ruth. He scared her a lot, and I think—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I think that's why she told me to run." The furnace breathed again. The wind moved the cedars. "Okay," Jack said. "We'll figure that out in the morning." He pulled the door almost closed, not all the way, she hadn't asked for all the way, and stood in the hallway for a moment listening. Listening to the house settle. Listening to the sound that had been missing from these walls for so long he'd stopped noticing its absence. The sound of someone else breathing. He went back downstairs and sat in the chair that faced both the front door and the window, and he did not sleep, because sleep was not the thing he did when something needed protecting. He sat with the lamp off and the fire going low and his hands loose on the arms of the chair, and he thought about a man named Mick Donovan, who he hadn't thought about in 4 years, because some part of his brain that still ran threat assessments automatically had already pulled that name from the file and placed it on the table between the problem and the solution. He didn't know yet why. He just knew that a little girl had run from something, and in his experience, the things that made little girls run were never small. Outside, the fog was still thick against the glass, and somewhere in the dark beyond the cedar trees, headlights swept slowly across the end of the private road, there for a moment, then gone. And Jack Morgan's hand found the arm of the chair and gripped it and did not let go. Someone had followed them home. The headlights were gone in under 3 seconds. Jack counted. Habit. In his experience, 3 seconds was not long enough to be someone who had made a wrong turn and corrected. 3 seconds was long enough to be someone who had found what they were looking for and decided not to announce it yet. He did not move from the chair. Moving was how you gave away your position, and his position right now was the only advantage he had. Inside, in the dark, with a clear sight line to both the front door and the window that faced the private road. He breathed slowly through his nose and listened to the house and listened past the house to the night outside and heard nothing. Wind, cedar branches. The distant complaint of something metallic on the old shed at the property's edge. A loose panel he had been meaning to fix for 2 years. Nothing human, nothing engineered, but the nothing felt occupied, felt watched. He sat that way for 40 minutes. The fire dropped to coals, the lamp on the end table stayed off. At some point past midnight, the wind shifted and the fog began to thin at the edges, and he could see the silhouette of the tree line against a sky that was slightly less dark than the land beneath it, and he watched that line for movement and saw none. At 12:47, he stood up. His knees announced themselves the way they always did in cold weather now, a fact he acknowledged without sentiment. He went to the window and stood to one side of it, not in front of it, and looked out. The private road was empty. The cedars were still. Wherever those headlights had belonged, they were gone. He checked the locks on the front door and the back door and the kitchen window that had a latch that sometimes worked loose in the cold. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened and heard, from the spare room, the slow and even sound of a child sleeping. It was such a particular sound, uncomplicated in a way that made his chest do something complicated. He went back to the chair. He did not sleep. By the time gray morning light started working through the fog and the kitchen clock read 6:14, Jack Morgan had been awake for 22 hours and had made 3 decisions. The first was that Lily stayed here until he understood the situation. The second was that he needed information he didn't have yet. The third was that getting that information was going to require making a phone call he had been avoiding for 4 years. He put the coffee on before he called. The coffee was not optional. The phone rang 4 times before it picked up, and the voice on the other end was rough with sleep and immediately suspicious, because the number calling was one that hadn't called in a long time. "Who died?" said the voice. "Nobody yet," Jack said. "I need to see you." A pause. The sound of movement, someone sitting up in bed, the particular acoustics of a man reorienting himself in darkness. "You need to see me," said Reuben Cross. And his voice was doing something complicated too, though in a completely different direction. "It's 6 in the morning, Jack." "I know what time it is." "You know what time it is," Reuben repeated. Another pause. "That bad?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need to see you." The pause this time was longer. Jack drank his coffee and waited and looked out the kitchen window at the cedar trees going from black shapes to green ones as the morning light came up slow and gray through the remaining fog. "Diner on Route 9, Reuben said finally. "The Millstone. Noon. I'll be there." "Jack." A beat. "You riding alone?" "I've got someone with me." The longest pause yet. "How old?" Reuben said. Jack looked at the ceiling toward the spare room. 5. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Jack checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected. "Noon," Reuben said. "Don't be late." He hung up first. Jack set the phone on the counter and finished his coffee standing at the window and watched the fog continue its retreat from the cedar trees. Somewhere in the distance, a crow was working on something that required a great deal of commentary. The shed panel ticked in the diminished wind. Ordinary morning sounds that felt, this particular morning, like they were describing a world that didn't quite apply to him anymore. He heard her on the stairs at 7:30. Not her footsteps first. He heard the door, and then the particular silence of a child who has opened a door and is standing at the top of a staircase assessing the situation below before committing to it. He respected that instinct. He did not call up to her. He refilled his coffee and started water for oatmeal and let her make her own calculations. She appeared in the kitchen doorway 2 minutes later. She was wearing the flannel shirt over her yellow dress, the shirt coming down past her knees, the sleeves rolled back 4 times and still hanging past her wrists. Her hair was loose and slightly tangled from sleep, and her feet were still bare, and she was holding the room key in her right fist. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "Oatmeal okay?" She thought about it with a seriousness that suggested this was an actual question requiring actual consideration. "Do you have brown sugar?" "I have white sugar, and I have honey." "Honey," she decided, and came and sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, very straight-backed, the key still in her fist. She watched him cook with the same assessing eyes she'd used in the doorway, tracking his movements around the kitchen, cataloging the exits he was probably unconscious of using, noting the placement of the phone on the counter. He saw her do all of this and said nothing about it because it was smart. It was the right way to be in an unfamiliar place with an unfamiliar person, and the fact that she was 5 years old and already knew, it told him everything he needed to know about what her life had looked like before the barn. He set the oatmeal in front of her with honey drizzled across the top, and she ate without being told to, and finished without being told to, and put the spoon down in the bowl precisely. "Jack," she said. "Yeah." "The man that scared Ruth." She looked at her empty bowl. "He came to the house 3 times. The last time he came, Ruth sent me to Mrs. Pelletier's house next door and told me not to come back until she called." She paused. She never called. Jack sat down across from her and put his coffee mug on the table and looked at her. How long ago was this? Before it got cold. Her forehead creased. Maybe a long time. Weeks, then. Maybe longer. He kept his face neutral. And Mrs. Pelletier? She let me stay for a while, and then she said I had to go. Lily's voice did not change, did not crack. It was the tone of a child who had processed this particular piece of information so many times that the raw part of it had worn smooth, like a stone in a riverbed. She called someone. I didn't want to wait for who it was, so I left. You ran. I ran, she confirmed. Jack sat with that, turned it over. A social worker call, probably, or someone from the county, the kind of institutional response that moved in its own time frame and did not ask the person at the center of it what they needed. He could not blame Mrs. Pelletier, who had done something when doing nothing would have been easier. He also could not pretend that the system she had called would have done right by this child in the short term, because he knew how those systems worked and how long they took, and what it felt like to be processed by them when you were small and frightened and did not understand why the adults in your life kept handing you to other adults who were strangers. He knew, because he had been handed to a few of those strangers himself, a very long time ago, on a different road in a different state, when he was not so different in age from the girl sitting across from him eating oatmeal with borrowed honey. Your parents, he said. Do you know where they are? Something shifted in Lily's face. The composure held, but something shifted underneath it. They went away, she said. Went away how? Ruth said they had to be somewhere safe. A pause. A very controlled pause. She said they were coming back. Jack looked at her. Do you believe that? Lily Harper looked back at him. I have to, she said. The crow outside had moved closer. The morning light was coming up thin and cold through the kitchen window, laying a pale rectangle across the table between them, and Jack thought about Daniel and Sarah Harper, names he didn't have yet, but shapes he was already assembling from the evidence in front of him. Parents who had left a child with a grandmother and disappeared to somewhere safe. A grandmother who had been frightened 3 times by the same man and had told a 5-year-old to run if anything happened. A child who had run through the dark and the cold and ended up in a barn talking to a stranger who happened to be the exact wrong kind of person for whoever had started this sequence of events to be dealing with right now. Jack's hand found his coffee mug and held it. Mick Donovan. The name sat in the back of his head where it had been sitting since the barn, patient and certain, the way bad things were when they had already decided to become your problem. He didn't know yet why his brain had produced it. He didn't know yet what the thread was between a man named Donovan and a family named Harper. But the thread was there. He could feel it the way he had learned to feel certain things, not with his hands, not with his eyes, with something older and less explainable that had kept him alive when the explainable things weren't enough. Get dressed, he said. We're going to meet someone. Lily looked down at herself. I only have this. He thought about that for a moment. Then he went upstairs and came back down with a pair of his own thermal socks, which she put on with great practicality and which came up past her knees, and a zip-up hoodie that functioned as a secondary dress over the flannel shirt and the yellow dress beneath it. She stood in the kitchen in this arrangement and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them commented on how she looked because how she looked was warm, and that was what mattered. He found an old pair of rubber garden boots in the mudroom that were still 3 sizes too large but workable with the socks, and she walked a practice circuit of the kitchen in them to demonstrate that she could manage, which she could, with an excess of determination that was going to cost him something to keep watching. They rode to the millstone at 11:40. He settled her in front of him on the bike again, the same configuration as the night before, and she held his forearm and watched the countryside emerge from the last traces of fog, and didn't say anything for the whole 14 miles. The cold was dry and cutting, and the sky overhead was the particular white of a day that was going to remain overcast and offer no warmth and no opinion. The Millstone Diner sat at the intersection of Route 9 and County Road 7, A squat building with aluminum siding and a sign that had lost 2 letters at some point and never replaced them, now reading the Miltini with the gap in between, giving it an accidental look of bewilderment. There were 4 vehicles in the lot when Jack pulled in. He recognized 2 of them, a black pickup with a cracked right taillight, Reuben's, and a road-worn Indian motorcycle, dark green, that belonged to a man named Calvin Marsh, who should not have been here because Jack had called Reuben and nobody else, which meant Reuben had made a decision Jack hadn't authorized, which was exactly the kind of thing that was going to require a conversation before it required anything else. He got Lily off the bike and held the diner door for her and felt her hesitate at the threshold the way she'd hesitated at the top of the stairs, doing her assessment, and he waited without comment while she did it. Reuben Cross was in the back booth. He was a big man, 51 years old, with the kind of face that had been rearranged once or twice and had set back in ways that were honest rather than handsome. Gray hair close-cropped above a beard that was more white than gray now, and a pair of hands on the table that looked like they had been built for a different purpose than whatever they were resting on. He was wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, and he had a cup of coffee that was already mostly gone, and his eyes were on the door when Jack walked in, and they moved immediately to Lily. And something happened in them that he didn't try to hide, and Jack was grateful he didn't try to hide it. Calvin Marsh was in the adjacent booth, turned sideways with his back against the wall and his boots up on the seat, which meant he was positioning himself to watch both the door and the room simultaneously. He was 43, lean and angular, with a scar that ran from his left jaw to his collarbone, and a stillness about him that people who didn't know him read as indifference, and people who did know him read as the opposite. He looked at Jack when Jack walked in and did not look away, which was Calvin's version of a greeting. Jack slid into the booth across from Reuben. Lily slid in beside him and sat close enough that her arm pressed against his and looked at the laminated menu with the focused attention of someone who intended to make a real decision. "She eat?" Reuben said. "Oatmeal, 2 hours ago." Reuben caught the eye of the server and held up 3 fingers and pointed at the menu and the server, who had been working this diner since the sign still had all its letters, nodded and disappeared. "You could have told me you were bringing backup," Jack said. "You could have called me in the last 4 years," Reuben said. "We're both dealing with disappointments." Calvin made a sound from the next booth that was not quite a laugh. Jack looked at Reuben. Reuben looked back at him, direct and unhurried, the way a man looked when he had been in enough situations that he didn't feel the need to perform composure anymore. He just was composed, the way a load-bearing wall was composed, not by effort, by structure. "Talk to me," Reuben said. Jack talked. He kept it concise and sequential the way he had learned to brief situations. The barn, the temperature, the girl, the headlights at the end of the road. He watched Reuben's face while he talked, and he watched Calvin's boots, which had come down off the seat somewhere around the mention of the headlights. When he got to Lily's description of the man who had frightened her grandmother, he stopped and looked at Lily, who had received pancakes at some point during his account and was engaged with them. "Lily," he said, "the man who came to see your grandmother, can you tell Reuben what he looked like?" She looked at Reuben, assessed him the way she assessed everything. "He was big," she said. "Like you, but meaner." She thought about it. He had a mark on his neck, like a burn. Jack felt rather than heard the change in the booth. It was not a sound. It was more like a pressure drop, the kind that preceded weather. Reuben's hands had gone still on the table. "Left side of the neck," Jack said. It was not a question. Reuben said nothing. "Reuben?" "Left side," Reuben said. His voice was doing something very careful. "Yeah." Calvin appeared at the end of the booth. He didn't sit. He just stood there with his coffee cup and his scar and his stillness, and looked at Jack with an expression that was asking a question Jack hadn't answered yet. "Mick Donovan," Jack said. The name landed the way names landed when everyone in the room already knew the weight of them. Lily kept eating her pancakes. The diner radio played something country and indifferent from the kitchen. "He's been out for 2 years, Calvin said. "You know that?" "I didn't know that." "Well," Calvin looked into his coffee. "He's been out for 2 years. Jack sat with that, rearranged things. "What's he been doing?" Running a crew out of Weston County, Reuben said, and his voice was back to level now, the careful thing resolved into something flatter and more workable. Not bikers. Freelancers. Guys who do what they're paid to do and don't ask about the rest. He paused. He's been looking for you. How long? Since about 18 months after he got out. Reuben looked at his coffee cup. We heard things. I didn't call because I didn't think... He stopped. I thought if nobody told you, you wouldn't go looking for it. Jack looked at him. I know, Reuben said. That wasn't your call. I know. I had a right to... I know, Jack. Reuben's voice was not apologetic exactly. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision he still believed in the logic of, even while acknowledging the cost of it. I know you did. The silence between them was the specific silence of men who had been through things together and had built up a language of silences to go alongside the language of words. And this particular silence was saying several things at once, none of which were going to be said out loud in a diner with a 5-year-old present. Lily set her fork down with precision. He wanted to know where my dad was, she said. All three men looked at her. She met their eyes one at a time, unhurried. I heard him, through the door. He told Ruth that he just wanted to talk to Daniel Harper, and she should tell him where Daniel was, and nothing bad would happen. She paused. But his voice was the kind of voice that means the opposite of what it says. Ruth's voice was like that too after, when she told me everything was fine. Jack looked at Reuben. Reuben looked at Jack. You know Daniel Harper, Jack said. It was not quite a question. Reuben exhaled through his nose. Daniel Harper worked a crew in Weston County about 3 years ago, before Donovan's people moved in. When Donovan took over the operation, Harper ran. Donovan lost money, equipment. He paused. And his second-in-command, who Harper apparently knew something about. What kind of something? The kind that puts people in a cell, Calvin said. Jack thought about a man named Daniel Harper, who had run from Mick Donovan and left his daughter with her grandmother and gone somewhere safe. He thought about what somewhere safe looked like when Donovan was the thing you were running from. He thought about the fact that Daniel Harper's daughter had ended up in a barn in November with no shoes on, which meant that whatever plan had been in place had not survived contact with the actual situation. He thought about Lily's voice saying, I have to, when he asked if she believed her parents were coming back. Where are they? He said. I don't know, Reuben said. That's the truth. Can you find out? A pause. I can try. Another pause, longer. Jack, if Donovan has been looking for you for 18 months and now he's got a line on this girl, he stopped, looked at Lily, who was listening to every word with the composed attention of a child who has learned that adults will talk around you if you appear occupied, and she had long since stopped appearing occupied when it mattered. He looked back at Jack. He's not going to stop. No, Jack said. He's not. Then we need to talk about what you want to do about that. Not here, Jack said. Reuben nodded. He looked at Lily again, and this time he let something show on his face that he didn't normally let show in public. Something that had to do with what he thought about a man who frightened old women and left children in barns and had the particular flavor of obsession that mistook cruelty for power. It was not a soft expression. But Lily looked at it, and whatever she was reading in it seemed to satisfy something in her assessment, because she picked up her fork again and went back to the pancakes. They paid separately and left separately. Jack took Lily to the bike and settled her in front of him and watched Reuben and Calvin stand by Reuben's truck and have the conversation that didn't need him present. Calvin's boots were apart on the asphalt. Reuben's hands were in his pockets. Neither of them was moving much. The kind of conversation that was mostly decided before it started. He rode home the long way. Through the back county roads, the ones that added 20 minutes but gave him a view of any following vehicle for 2 miles in either direction. He saw nothing. He felt the nothing the same way he'd felt the headlights. Not as absence, but as patience. The afternoon was gray and cold, and they spent it inside. Lily found a deck of cards in the drawer of the coffee table and organized them by suit on the floor with a methodical thoroughness that occupied her completely. And Jack sat in the chair that faced the door and worked his phone, making calls he didn't want to make to people he hadn't spoken to in years, trading information in the currency of favors owed and favors new. By 4 o'clock, he knew that Daniel and Sarah Harper had been relocated 6 months ago, with help from someone Reuben knew in a county east of the state line. He knew that the relocation had been informal, not witness protection, not anything official, just people who knew how to make other people temporarily invisible when the alternative was worse. He knew that the contact who had arranged it had gone quiet 3 weeks ago. He sat with that for a long time while the afternoon light failed in the windows. 3 weeks ago. Around the time Lily's grandmother Ruth had started receiving visits from a man with a burn scar on the left side of his neck. It was not a coincidence. Jack did not deal in coincidences. He dealt in sequences, in causality, in the disciplined refusal to look at connected things and pretend they weren't connected because the connection was inconvenient. Someone had found the contact, and the contact had talked, or the contact had been persuaded. And now Donovan knew something, though Jack couldn't be sure yet what he knew. Whether he knew where Daniel and Sarah were, or whether he knew that he didn't know and was applying pressure to the grandmother to get there. Ruth's refusal. The visit stopping. The instruction to Lily to run. Ruth had protected her granddaughter the only way she could. The thought of what that protection might have cost her hit Jack in a place he didn't acknowledge out loud, and he looked at the fire and let the calculation settle into him without trying to soften it. At 5:30, his phone buzzed. Reuben. A text, 4 words. Donovan's people were in town. Then, 30 seconds later, last night. Jack stood up from the chair. Lily looked up from the cards on the floor. She read something in the way he was standing that made her go still. What happened? She said. He looked at her. At this 5-year-old who had earned the right to honest information by demonstrating consistently that she could handle it. Someone was watching the house last night, he said. I saw headlights at the end of the road. She nodded once, like she had already calculated this possibility and filed it accordingly. Are we safe here? The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. Tonight, he said. Tonight we are. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the cards on the floor, at the careful organization of suits and numbers she had been building. Jack? She said. Yeah. My dad. When you find him. She placed the ace of spades at the top of its column with great precision. Tell him Ruth was brave. The fire made its sounds. The wind moved the cedars. The evening pressed against the windows, dark coming early the way it did in November. The dark arriving like a decision rather than a gradual thing. Jack's phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but the area code was one he knew from the map. The county east of the state line where Daniel and Sarah Harper had been relocated 6 months ago, and so he answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, and it was the voice of someone who had been holding fear inside a controlled container for a long time, and the container had just reached its limit. My name is Sarah Harper, she said. I think you have my daughter. Jack's hand tightened on the phone. She's safe, he said. She's right here. A sound on the other end of the line that he did not categorize because it was private and not his. Then, he found us. Sarah Harper's voice had dropped to something almost inaudible. He found us 3 days ago. We got out, but Daniel... A breath, a controlled, deliberate breath. Daniel went back for something, and he hasn't come back, and I don't know where he is, and I don't know who to call, and someone gave me this number and said, Stop, Jack said. Gentle, but firm, the way you stopped someone who was about to say too much on an unsecured line. Don't tell me where you are on this call. A silence. I know someone you can trust, Jack said. His name is Reuben Cross. I'm going to give you his number, and you're going to call him, and he's going to get you somewhere safe. Do you understand? What about Daniel? Jack looked at the fire, at the ceiling, at Lily on the floor with her cards, who had not moved but was listening with every part of her body. I'm going to find Daniel, he said. The words came out of him without the kind of deliberation they should have required. They came out like something that had already been decided, like a door he had already walked through without realizing it. And on the other side of it was a version of this situation that had no neutral option anymore. Mick Donovan had Daniel Harper. Which meant Mick Donovan was not a problem that was going to resolve itself if Jack kept his distance and waited. It was not a problem that patience or information or careful positioning was going to solve. It was a problem that had already passed the point where careful solutions applied and had arrived, with the quiet inevitability of things that had been building for years, at the point where the only remaining variable was what Jack Morgan was willing to do about it. He gave Sarah Harper Reuben's number. He ended the call. He sat back down in the chair and looked at the wall above the fireplace, at the shotgun on its two hooks, at the maps and the photographs, and the accumulated evidence of a life he had built specifically to avoid arriving at this moment. And then Lily Harper looked up from the floor and said, very quietly, "You already know the man who has my dad, don't you?" It wasn't a question. Jack Morgan looked at this 5-year-old who had run through the dark and the cold and ended up in his barn and eaten his oatmeal with honey and organized a deck of cards on his floor while the world her parents had tried to build around her came apart at every seam. And he thought about what it meant to promise something to a person who had no reason left to believe that promises held. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "Is that why he was watching the house last night?" "Yeah." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the cards on the floor. Then she looked back at him. "Then you have to go get my dad," she said, "and I have to stay here." "You'd be with Reuben," he said. "He's safe," she said. "I know, I could tell." She paused. "He looks at you the way Ruth looked at things she had decided to protect." Jack said nothing. "Go get my dad, Jack." Her voice was steady and 5 years old and completely without doubt. "And come back." He sat in the chair with the fire going low and the dark pressing the windows and a child's trust sitting in his hands like something that weighed more than it had any right to weigh. And he thought about Mick Donovan and what a man like that did with leverage and what he was willing to do to a man named Daniel Harper to get the thing he actually wanted. The thing he actually wanted was Jack. That had always been the answer, sitting in the back of the file where his brain kept the threat assessments, patient and certain. Lily was bait. Daniel was bait. Ruth had been pressure. All of it was designed to move Jack Morgan out of the Cedar Hills and into a situation where Mick Donovan controlled the terms. Jack knew this, and he was going anyway. Not because he'd been outmaneuvered, not because he didn't see the shape of the trap, but because Daniel Harper was a man who had a daughter who organized playing cards on the floor with the same methodical care that other people used to hold their lives together. And that daughter had looked at Jack Morgan with eyes that had seen enough to be done with trust and had chosen it anyway. He reached for his phone. He called Reuben. "I need you to come get Lily tonight," he said when Reuben picked up. "And I need you to bring Calvin." A beat. "Jack." "Donovan has Daniel Harper," Jack said, "and Daniel Harper has a daughter who told me to come back." The silence on Reuben's end lasted exactly long enough. "We'll be there by 9, Reuben said. "Bring the others," Jack said. And then, because it needed to be said, even though saying it meant something he hadn't said out loud in 4 years, "It's time." He ended the call. Outside in the dark, somewhere beyond the cedar trees and the private road and the county roads that wound between the forgotten farms of Harlan County, Mick Donovan was waiting for Jack Morgan to do exactly what Jack Morgan had just decided to do. The difference between them was not what they were willing to do. It was why. And in Jack's experience, the why was the only thing that mattered when everything else had been stripped away and two men were left standing in the dark with nothing between them but what they had each decided to become. He looked at Lily. She had put the Ace of Hearts at the top of its column, and she was looking at it with the focused consideration of someone arranging something that mattered. "All done," she said, and looked up at him with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something adjacent to it, something that lived in the space between relief and determination. Jack Morgan had been many things in his life: soldier, brother, failure, ghost. Tonight, for the first time in more years than he wanted to count, he was going to be something else. He just hadn't decided yet if he would survive. Reuben's truck came up the private road at 8:53. Jack heard it before he saw it. The particular sound of that engine, the way it settled into a lower register on the gravel incline. Familiar in the way that things become familiar when you've listened for them in the dark often enough. He was already standing at the window when the headlights came through the cedar trees, and behind the truck, 2 motorcycles. Calvin's dark green Indian and another bike he recognized even in the dark by the sound alone. A modified Softail that belonged to a man named Priest, who was not a man of any particular faith, but had gotten the name from the way he delivered bad news, quietly and without apology, as if he were administering something you needed regardless of whether you wanted it. 3 men. That was what Reuben had brought. Jack had asked for the others, plural, and 3 was what had come, and he stood at the window and did the math on that for a moment before he went to the door. Lily was upstairs. He had explained things to her an hour ago in the careful, honest language she seemed to require. That people she could trust were coming, that she was going with them somewhere safe, that he was going to find her father, and her mother was already being taken somewhere Donovan couldn't reach. She had listened to all of it, with her hands flat on the bedspread, and her eyes on his face, and when he finished, she had asked one question. "Do you promise to come back?" He had looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who made promises he wasn't certain he could keep. He had broken enough of them in his life to know the exact weight of a promise made carelessly. "I promise to try," he said. She had considered this. "That's the honest answer," she said, and he understood that she was giving him credit for it, which was its own particular weight to carry. Now he opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, and the cold hit him clean and sharp, and the 3 men came across the yard in the amber of the porch light, their boots loud on the frozen ground. Reuben first, Calvin behind him, Priest slightly apart from both of them, the way he always positioned himself, slightly outside the center of any gathering, watching the edges. They came up onto the porch and nobody shook hands, because that wasn't how it worked with men who had known each other long enough. "Where's the girl?" Reuben said. "Upstairs. She's ready." Jack looked past them at the 2 motorcycles sitting in the yard. 3, he said. 4, Reuben said. "Wade's positioned on the county road. Has been since 6. Jack looked at him. "You called me this morning," Reuben said. "I started making calls this morning." Jack said nothing for a moment. Then, "Who else knows?" "The people who need to." "That's not an answer." Reuben's jaw worked. 7 men total, who I trust with my life and yours and that little girl's. That's who knows. He paused. And 1 man who I wasn't sure about until today. What happened today? Reuben and Calvin exchanged something wordless. Priest was looking at the tree line. "Come inside," Jack said. They came in. The house felt different with 3 large men in it. The air redistributed, the furniture suddenly smaller in proportion. Priest moved to the window that faced the road without being asked and stood there with his coffee when Jack poured it, watching the dark. Calvin sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his mug and his scar catching the light in a way that made it look like a seam, like he'd been taken apart once and put back together, and the reassembly had been functional rather than aesthetic. Reuben sat across from Calvin and looked at Jack. "Donovan's been building something," Reuben said. "For the better part of 2 years. We thought it was a territory operation. Weston County, moving product, the usual architecture." He paused. "It's not that." Jack waited. "It's infrastructure," Reuben said. "He's been acquiring people. Law enforcement. 2 county sheriffs that we know of. A judge in the 3rd district. Someone in the state DOT who controls permit approvals for a corridor that runs—" He stopped. "Jack, he's not running a crew. He's building a machine. The kind of machine where if you pull on the wrong thread, the whole thing is designed to come down on whoever's pulling." The kitchen was quiet except for the furnace and the wind and Priest's breathing at the window. "And Daniel Harper," Jack said. "Harper worked Donovan's books," Calvin said. It was the first thing he'd said since arriving. His voice was low and had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they had verified past the point of doubt. Not product, not logistics, financial architecture, shell companies, layered accounts, the paper that makes the machine look legal from the outside. He looked at his coffee. He knew everything. Every name, every account, every connection. A pause. And 8 months ago, he copied it. Jack stood very still. "All of it?" he said. "Enough," Calvin said. "Enough to bring down every man Donovan owns in this state and 2 adjacent ones." He looked up from the coffee. That's what Donovan wants back, not Harper. Not revenge, the documentation Harper took when he ran. Jack thought about Sarah Harper's voice on the phone. He found us 3 days ago. Daniel went back for something, and he hasn't come back. Went back for something. He didn't go back, Jack said. He was taken. We think so, Reuben said. Yes. Then Donovan has the documentation already. No, Reuben said. That's the thing. He leaned forward. Harper was smart about it. Whatever he took, he didn't carry it with him. He distributed it, put pieces with different people, different locations. Donovan has Harper, and he's trying to reconstruct where the pieces are. But Harper hasn't given him enough to work with. His voice was careful. Which means Harper is still alive because he's the only one who knows where everything is. But that window closes the moment Donovan decides he's gotten everything he's going to get. The fire made its sounds. Calvin turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. Priest at the window had not moved. Where's he holding him? Jack said. That's the problem, Reuben said. And here something came into his voice that Jack recognized as the reason Reuben had hesitated on the phone. The thing he hadn't wanted to say. Our information says the old Carver salvage yard, outside Weston. You know it. Jack knew it. He knew it because he had been there before. 12 years ago, in a different context, under different circumstances. Before the Cedar Hills safe house and the 4 years of deliberate quiet. He knew it because it was the place where he had made the decision that had saved Mick Donovan's life, in a situation where letting Mick Donovan die would have been the simpler choice, and almost certainly the wiser one. He had not chosen the simpler choice. He stood in his kitchen now and thought about the 12-year compounding interest on that decision, and did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. There's something else, Reuben said. His voice had changed again, shifted into a register Jack associated with the worst category of information, not dangerous information, not logistically complicated information, but the kind that reorganized what you thought you knew and required you to rebuild from a foundation that had turned out to be different from the one you were standing on. Jack looked at him. Reuben looked back. The expression on his face was one of a man about to do something he considered necessary and did not consider kind. The contact who helped relocate Daniel and Sarah Harper, Reuben said. The one who went quiet 3 weeks ago. Yeah. His name was Garrett Fossey. The name landed in the room, and Jack heard it and placed it and felt the placing of it move through him like cold water, starting at the back of his skull and working down. Garrett Fossey had been Iron Wolves. Original chapter. A man Jack had ridden with for 6 years in another life. A man who had been present on the night at the Carver salvage yard 12 years ago, one of 4 men who had been there and seen what happened and understood what it meant. A man who had left the club 2 years after that night and moved east and built a quiet life, and who Jack had thought of occasionally in the way you thought of people who shared a specific gravity with you. Not close anymore, but oriented toward the same center. He went quiet 3 weeks ago, Jack said. His voice came out even. He was working to keep it even. We found him 4 days ago, Reuben said, outside Weston County. A pause. He'd been dead for about a week. The kitchen felt smaller. The walls did the thing walls did in Jack's experience when the information they were containing got too large for the space. He turned to the window. Priest stepped slightly aside to give him room, and he looked out at the dark and the cedar trees and the frozen yard, and he breathed through his nose the way he'd learned to breathe in situations where the next thing he said needed to come from the rational part of his brain rather than the part that was currently white and loud. Garrett Fossey was dead. Garrett Fossey, who had helped hide Daniel and Sarah Harper. Which meant Donovan had found Fossey before he found Harper. Which meant the chain ran the other direction from what Jack had assumed, not Harper to Fossey to relocation, but Donovan to Fossey to Harper. Donovan had followed the thread backward, had found the man who had done the hiding, and Fossey had been dead for a week. 7 days. Before Sarah Harper's call, before the headlights at the end of the road, before any of the sequence of events that had begun with a crying child in a barn on Route 9. He knew where the safe house was, Jack said. Not a question. He arranged it, Reuben said. He would have known. Jack turned from the window. His hands were at his sides, and his face was the face he wore in situations where showing what he was feeling was a luxury the situation could not afford. Which means Donovan's been sitting on Harper's location for at least a week, possibly longer. Yes. And he didn't move immediately. No. He waited. Yes. Jack looked at Reuben, and Reuben looked back at him, and the thing they were both looking at was the shape of it, the architecture of what Donovan had built, not just the shell companies and the compromised officials, but this specific sequence, the way each piece had been positioned to move Jack toward a particular place. He was waiting for me to come to him, Jack said. That's what we think, Reuben said. Harper is secondary. The documents are secondary. He could have broken Harper by now if that was all he wanted. His jaw was tight. He set it up. The grandmother, the girl, the relocation that he let us find. He let us find, Jack said. The number that Sarah Harper called. The one she said someone gave her. Reuben's voice was doing the careful thing again. We can't verify who gave her that number. Jack stood absolutely still. The number Sarah Harper had called was Jack's number, a number that 8 people in the world had, a number that had been his private line since the Cedar Hills house, the number he gave only to people he trusted past the point of ordinary trust. Someone gave her my number, he said slowly. Someone who knew it, Calvin said. Quiet. Flat. And knew you'd answer. Jack's eyes moved to Reuben. How many people have that number? You know how many. Say it. 8, Reuben said. You, me, Calvin, Priest, Wade, Fossey, and 2 others. Fossey is dead, Jack said. Yes. Which leaves one of the other 7. The silence that came after that was not the silence of men who hadn't considered this. It was the silence of men who had been considering nothing else since the number came up, and who had arrived at the edge of a conclusion that none of them wanted to be the first to voice, because voicing it made it real in a way that thinking it did not. Priest turned from the window. He said, "It's not me." Calvin said, "It's not me." Reuben said nothing. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them with the expression of a man who has been turning a stone over and over for hours and has finally decided to look at what lives underneath. "Reuben," Jack said. "Wade's been on the county road since 6, Reuben said. I sent him there. He knows where we are." He paused. "I've known Wade for 11 years, Jack. I've known him for 9. He rode with us through— I know what he rode with us through." Jack's voice was quiet and cold and completely without anger, which was worse than anger, which Reuben knew was worse than anger. "How many people did you tell before you came here tonight?" "The 7, that's all." "And Wade was one of them." A pause, a long, slow, deliberate pause. "Yeah," Reuben said. "Wade was one of them." Jack crossed to the back door and opened it, and stepped out onto the back porch and stood in the cold with the door open behind him, and breathed the night air in through his nose and let the cold do what cold did, which was clarify things by removing everything that wasn't necessary. The cedar trees were dark shapes against a slightly lighter dark. The frozen ground was pale and still. The shed panel ticked. Normal sounds. Then he listened past the normal sounds. Somewhere on the county road, a quarter-mile from the end of the private road, was a man named Wade Curran sitting on a motorcycle in the cold, positioned to watch for approaching vehicles. A man Reuben had called this morning. A man who had known by 9 a.m. that Jack Morgan had a child in his safe house, and that the situation involved Mick Donovan. A man who had Jack's private number and who had access to a frightened woman who needed it. Jack stood on the back porch and thought about 11 years of trust and what it was worth, and what you did with the arithmetic when it came out wrong. Then he went back inside. "I need to go to the salvage yard tonight," he said. "Jack, I need to go tonight because if there's a leak and Donovan knows we're moving, then every hour I wait is an hour Daniel Harper doesn't have." He looked at Reuben. "You know I'm right." Reuben's jaw worked. He did not say Jack was wrong because Jack was not wrong. "You can't go alone," Calvin said. "I'm not going alone." He looked at Reuben, at Calvin, at Priest, who had come away from the window and was standing with his coffee cup in both hands, and an expression that was already past the conversation and into what came after it. But Wade doesn't come. Wade doesn't know we suspect him, Calvin said. If we pull him off the road, he knows something changed. Then we don't pull him off the road, Jack said. We leave him where he is. He looked at the ceiling, listening. From upstairs, nothing. Lily was either asleep or doing the thing she did where she was completely silent and completely present simultaneously. He lowered his voice, and we move before he can report in. Reuben sat with that. His hands came off the table and he rubbed them over his face, and then he put them back down. If you go into the salvage yard and Donovan's expecting you, he's been expecting me for 18 months, Jack said. The difference tonight is that I know he's expecting me. That's not as much of an advantage as you're making it sound. I know. Calvin looked at Priest. Priest looked at Calvin. Something passed between them that was shorter and denser than language, and then Calvin looked back at Jack. 4 men in a salvage yard with Donovan's crew, Calvin said. What's your number? I don't know his number. Guess. Jack thought about the infrastructure Reuben had described. The machine. The kind of operation that required bodies to protect it. 8 to 12, he said. Minimum. Calvin nodded once. Like this was acceptable. Like the math was simply the math, and you did it the same way you did any other math. I know a man in Weston County, Priest said. His voice was the way his voice always was. Unhurried, precise, carrying the specific gravity of someone who selected words the way a surgeon selected instruments. He owes me a significant thing. He can get us the current layout of the Carver yard. Access points, lighting, where they keep people they're holding. How long? Jack said. An hour. Maybe less. Jack looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 9:14. Make the call, he said. Priest set his coffee cup down on the counter with the same care Lily had used setting her oatmeal bowl down that morning and went outside with his phone, and the back door closed behind him, and the kitchen was 3 men and the particular quality of silence that existed between people who were past the planning stage and into the commitment stage, where silence meant something different from what it meant before. Jack went upstairs. Lily was in bed with the lamp on, the deck of cards on the blanket in front of her, sorted back into its box. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression was the one she had been wearing all evening, composed, watchful, older than it had any right to be. You're going now, she said. Soon. The men downstairs. She paused. Reuben's voice changed when he was talking. Jack looked at her. Yeah, he said. It did. Is that bad? He considered the honest answer versus the kind answer and arrived, as he always arrived with her, at the understanding that with Lily Harper they were the same answer. It's complicated, he said, but it doesn't change what we're doing. She looked at her hands, then at him. Is there someone who isn't what you thought they were? Jack was quiet for a moment. Maybe, he said. We don't know yet. She absorbed that. Ruth used to say that the hardest thing was finding out someone chose the wrong side. A pause. She said it was worse than an enemy because at least an enemy was always an enemy. Jack stood in the doorway of the spare room that had not been slept in since he could remember, and looked at this 5-year-old who carried her grandmother's words around like tools, using them when they were needed, and he thought that Ruth Harper had been a woman worth knowing, and the knowledge of what her protection of this child might have cost her hit him again in the same place as before, the place he didn't acknowledge out loud. Go with Reuben, he said. Do what he says. Don't go anywhere that wasn't planned. I know. If anything feels wrong, I'll tell Reuben. She looked at him. Jack, you have to come back, not just try. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. Okay? She held his gaze for another second, and what she was doing, he understood, was memorizing him. The way children memorize things they were afraid of losing, carefully and completely, so that the image was sharp enough to survive whatever came next. He pulled the door almost closed and went downstairs. Priest was back inside. He was standing at the kitchen counter, and his expression had shifted into something Jack hadn't seen on Priest's face in years. A tightening around the eyes, a set to the jaw that suggested the information he had received had reorganized something. "What?" Jack said. Priest looked at him. "The Carver salvage yard. My contact says there are 10 men on the perimeter, armed, rotational." He paused. "And 2 men on the inside with Harper." "2 we can work with," Calvin said. "The 2 men on the inside," Priest said, "are not Donovan's regular crew." He looked at Jack, and the look had an apology in it that Priest would never voice because it was not his nature to voice apologies, only to acknowledge the necessity of delivering things that hurt. "My contact identified one of them." The kitchen waited. "Eddie Craw," Priest said. Jack went still. Eddie Craw was 26 years old. He had come to the Iron Wolves 3 years ago through Reuben, vouched for, recommended with the kind of confidence that came from prior knowledge. He had been a prospect for 8 months and had patched in with a vote that was unanimous, including Jack's. He had ridden with them for 2 years after that. He had been present at conversations that required trust. He had access, not to the private number that was too small a circle, but to information about the operation's shape, about who was connected to whom, about the architecture of how the Iron Wolves moved and communicated. He had left the chapter 6 months ago. Quietly. Personal reasons, he had said. A woman in another county, an aging parent, the usual language of a life reorienting itself. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody had questioned it because Reuben had vouched for him. Jack looked at Reuben. Reuben's face had done something Jack had never seen it do in 11 years of knowing the man. It had gone blank. Not the controlled blankness of a man managing his expression, the involuntary blank of a man whose processing system had encountered something it could not immediately integrate. His hands were flat on the table and he was looking at them and the knuckles were white. "Reuben?" Jack said. Reuben said nothing. "Reuben," harder. "I vouched for him." Reuben's voice was barely there. "I vouched for him from the beginning. I know. I brought him in. I know." "Jack." He looked up, and what was in his face now was not blankness but something raw and scorched, the face of a man who has just understood that something he built has been used against the people he built it for. "I brought him in. He was inside for 2 years. He knew—" He stopped, started again. "How long? That's what I want to know. How long was he—" "We don't know that yet," Calvin said. Quiet, firm. "We will," Priest said. The kitchen was very quiet. The furnace breathed. The fire had gone low. Somewhere above them the house made its settling sounds, the sound of a structure doing what structures did, holding its shape against pressure, adjusting to the cold, maintaining. Jack thought about Eddie Craw's face, young, open, the kind of openness that he had read at the time as youth, as someone who hadn't been in enough situations yet to learn the economy of expression. He thought about what he should have read instead, and did not torture himself with the gap between the two things, because that particular torture was not useful right now. "This changes the math," Calvin said. "If Craw reported our movements," "He reported them," Jack said. "Assume he reported them. Then Donovan knows we're coming." "Yes." "Which means the salvage yard is a—" "Yes," Jack said. The word that Calvin hadn't said sat in the room anyway. Trap. A word that in Jack's experience had a particular sound to it when said out loud in a space where everyone already knew it, a sound like a door locking from the outside. "You still want to go," Reuben said. It was not quite a question. Jack looked at him. "Daniel Harper is in that building," he said. "Whatever else the yard is, it's also that." "And if we walk into it, then we walk into it knowing what it is," Jack said. "That's the only advantage Donovan doesn't know we have." He looked at each of them in turn. Calvin, who was already past the argument and into the logistics. Priest, who had been there since his contact finished talking. Reuben, who was working through something that was going to take longer than tonight to fully process, but who would not, Jack knew with the certainty of 11 years, let that processing stop him from being present for what was required. "He thinks he set the terms," Jack said. "He thinks I'm coming in blind, angry, and alone, because that's how he designed it to play out. He doesn't know we made Craw. He doesn't know we know about the layout. And he doesn't know. Jack stopped. He thought about Lily upstairs. He thought about what she had said about the honest answer. He thought about a man named Mick Donovan who had spent 18 months building a machine designed to deliver Jack Morgan to a salvage yard outside Weston County, and who had used a child and a dead man and a compromised brother to do it, and who had understood clearly that the only way to move Jack was through something Jack valued more than his own safety. He thought about what it meant that Donovan had understood that correctly, and he thought about what it meant that Donovan had not understood, not at any point in the 18 months of his architecture, that the things Jack valued most were not weaknesses. They were the reason he was still here. "He doesn't know why I'm coming," Jack said. The three men in his kitchen looked at him. "He thinks I'm coming because he forced me to," Jack said. "He thinks the girl and the parents and Fosse and all of it, he thinks that's what moved me, the pressure." He looked at the table, at the empty coffee cups and the maps he'd pulled out while Priest was on the phone, and the accumulated evidence of four men planning something in the particular way that men plan things when they had been in enough situations to know that planning and outcome were related, but not identical. "He doesn't know that I'm coming because a 5-year-old looked at me and said, 'Come back. Not try. Come back.'" He looked up. "That's a different thing. That's not pressure. That's a promise." Reuben looked at him for a long moment. Something was working in his face, something that was going to take its time arriving at the surface. "You think a promise is going to keep you alive in a salvage yard with 10 men on the perimeter," Reuben said. "No," Jack said. "You three are going to keep me alive. The promise is going to keep me from becoming what Donovan wants me to become while you're doing it." Calvin looked at Priest. Priest picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands, and looked at Jack the way Priest looked at things he had measured and found to be what they appeared to be. "Then let's go," Priest said. They moved in the next 20 minutes with the particular efficiency of men who had done difficult things in compressed time frames before and knew how to separate the necessary from the optional. Jack went upstairs one final time. The spare room door was open slightly, and through the gap he could see Lily, lying on her side with the lamp still on, her eyes closed, the deck of cards in its box on the nightstand beside the key. He watched her breathe for a moment, the slow and even breath of a child who had decided to trust the situation enough to sleep in it, which was its own particular kind of courage. He pulled the door to its almost closed position and went down. Reuben went to the spare room after him, brief, quiet, and came back with an expression that was working very hard at something and mostly succeeding. They left the house dark except for the porch light. They rode with the engines low and the headlights cutting the November dark, and the county road running out ahead of them cold and pale and empty in all directions. Jack rode at the front. Behind him, Reuben. Behind Reuben, Calvin and Priest side by side, in the way that men rode when they were covering ground and watching in both directions simultaneously. 4 bikes. 4 engines finding their shared rhythm on the road. At the end of the private road, where it met the county road, there was no motorcycle waiting in the dark. Wade Curran's position was empty. The man was gone. Jack stopped his bike. The others stopped behind him. He sat in the dark and looked at the empty road and felt the geometry of the night reorganize around this fact. The missing man, the empty position, the phone call that had already been made to someone who was now doing something with the information. He looked over his shoulder. Reuben was looking at the empty position too. His face in the cold dark was the face of a man who has added one more number to a calculation he wished had come out differently. "How far to the salvage yard?" Calvin said. Low, engine muffled. 22 miles, Jack said. "Then we have maybe 40 minutes before he gets word to—" "We have less than that," Jack said. "He's been gone long enough for the cold to clear from the asphalt where he was sitting." He felt rather than heard the collective recalibration of the 3 men behind him. 22 miles. A salvage yard that already knew they were coming and had just received confirmation of exactly when. 10 men on the perimeter, 2 inside, Donovan somewhere in the architecture of the place, and Daniel Harper with whatever time he had left narrowing with every passing minute. Jack Morgan put his bike in gear. The engine rose under him, that familiar voice, that sound that had carried him through more nights than he could name, and he pulled onto the county road and accelerated into the dark and the cold, and the trap that was waiting 22 miles ahead, and the 3 men who had come when he called came behind him, and the road was empty and the night was deep, and somewhere ahead of them the lights of the Carver salvage yard were burning amber and red against the low clouds, visible now from 5 miles out. A glow on the horizon like something that had been waiting a long time to... The glow on the horizon resolved itself into specifics as they closed the distance. Amber work lights on poles, a chain-link fence running the perimeter with maybe 8 feet of cleared ground inside it before the first rows of stacked cars began. A gate on the south approach, padlocked, with a man-sized gap where the chain had been left deliberately loose, the kind of invitation that announced itself as an invitation, which was the point, which was why Jack did not take it. He pulled off the county road a quarter-mile out, behind a collapsed equipment shed that gave them cover from the road and a partial sightline to the yard's eastern fence. The others came in behind him, and they killed the engines, and the silence that replaced the engine noise was the particular silence of a place where things were about to happen, and the air knew it already. 4 men crouched in the dark behind a shed that smelled of old oil and rusted iron and November cold. Jack studied the yard through a gap in the shed's siding. His breath made small clouds. His heartbeat was the slow, deliberate rhythm of a body that had learned the difference between fear and readiness and had made its choice. "East fence," he said, low, below the wind. "There's a section near the back corner where the terrain dips. Chain link follows the grade. There'll be a gap at the bottom." "Covered," Calvin said. "Probably." Jack watched the patrol pattern. 1 man moving along the east fence, slow, hands in pockets against the cold, making his circuit with the particular boredom of someone who had been told to walk and walk and walk, and didn't expect anything to walk toward. But his attention's on the inside, not the outside. "Because they know we're coming through the gate," Priest said. "Right." "So we don't come through the gate," Reuben said. "No." Jack turned from the gap. The 4 of them were very close in the dark, their faces barely visible to each other. "We split. Priest, east fence with me, Reuben, Calvin, north approach. There's a section near the old way station that's been patched with a different gauge wire. Weaker. 11 years ago, it was weak enough to work with bare hands." 11 years is a long time," Calvin said. "Yes, it is." Jack looked at him. "But Donovan hasn't touched this yard in 2 years, and he won't have invested in the infrastructure. He's using it because it's available, not because it's fortified." A pause. Calvin nodded once. "Daniel Harper will be in the main building," Jack said. "The one at the center of the yard. Back when this place operated, it was the assessment bay. 2 large vehicle doors, small office on the north end, hydraulic lifts in the floor that don't work anymore. There are exactly 2 places in that building where you hold someone. The office, if you want them mobile. The lift pit, if you don't." He did not say which he thought it was. He didn't need to. The 3 men listening to him knew how Donovan thought. They had all known him at different removes and different times, and there was a shared grammar to that knowledge that didn't require elaboration. "We move in 5 minutes," Jack said. "Phones off. Whatever happens inside that yard, we don't stop for each other unless there's no other option." He paused. "Daniel Harper comes out. That's the objective. Everything else is secondary." Reuben put his hand on Jack's shoulder. "Not hard. The way you touched someone when words were insufficient and contact was the only remaining currency." Then they separated into the dark. Jack and Priest moved along the outside of the eastern fence, low and slow, keeping to the shadow line where the work lights didn't reach. The guard on the interior circuit was 40 yards ahead and moving away from them, his back a dark shape against the amber glow of the yard. Jack watched the shape and timed his movement to it, covering ground when the guard's arc was away, going still when it turned back. Priest moved beside him with the silence of a man who had learned how to be still and how to move as 2 separate disciplines, each absolute in its domain. The terrain dipped near the back corner exactly as Jack had said it would. The chain link followed the grade, and at the lowest point there was a gap of 8 inches between the bottom of the fence and the frozen ground. Not enough for a man to slide through without work. Jack went flat and worked his shoulders through first, the frozen earth hard against his chest, the chain link dragging across his back, with a sound he killed by moving slowly, a quarter inch at a time. The leather vest caught once, and he held completely still for 4 seconds while the guard completed a turn and resumed his away-facing circuit, and then he worked the vest free and came through. Priest came through behind him in less time and with less sound. They were inside. The yard was a geography of shadows and amber pools. Stacked cars rose on either side of the aisle they moved through, their crushed shapes making walls that absorbed sound and provided cover in alternating intervals. The smell in here was different from outside, oil and iron intensified, rubber gone to rot, and underneath it something chemical and sharp that Jack's nose categorized and filed without dwelling on. The main building was 60 yards ahead. Its vehicle doors were down. Through the gap at the bottom of the nearer door, a line of brighter light, white, work lamp white, the kind of light you used when you needed to see clearly what you were doing to someone. Jack stopped at the corner of a stack of compressed sedans. Priest came up beside him. They looked at the building and at the two men positioned outside the vehicle doors. Not walking, standing, one on each side, the posture of men who were guarding rather than patrolling, which meant they expected the action to come from a specific direction and were pointed toward it. The gate. South approach. They were watching south. Jack tapped Priest's arm twice. Priest looked at him. Jack pointed. Himself left, Priest right. Priest nodded once and disappeared around the right side of the car stack, and Jack moved left, keeping the stacks between himself and the two door guards, closing the distance to the building from an angle that wasn't covered. He was 20 yards out when he heard the north fence. Not loud. A sound like someone breathing wrong, a single metallic complaint, quickly killed. Reuben and Calvin were through. One of the door guards turned his head, a reflex, not a confirmed sound. The kind of half movement a body made when it registered something below the threshold of certainty. Jack went completely still against the car stack and watched the guard's head and waited while the guard's body completed its threat assessment and arrived, incorrectly, at the conclusion that the sound had been wind or settling metal. The guard turned back south. Jack covered the remaining 20 yards to the building's wall in the next 8 seconds. The wall was corrugated metal, cold under his palms, and he moved along it toward the personnel door on the building's north end. The small door that wasn't the main vehicle entrance, the one that supervisors used to access the office without going through the bay. It was not locked. The padlock hasp was there, but the lock itself was open, hanging from the hasp by its shackle, the way locks were left when people were moving in and out frequently enough that locking was more trouble than it was worth. He opened it. The office was empty. Desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, a window that looked into the bay through safety glass that was yellowed and scratched. He crossed to the window and looked through it. The bay was lit with 4 work lamps on tripod stands, the white light filling the space and throwing hard shadows from the cars that were parked or positioned in various stages of assessment. The hydraulic lift pits were in the center of the floor, 2 of them, rectangular depressions in the concrete approximately 6 feet deep. Daniel Harper was in the nearer one. Jack knew it was Harper before he could see the man's face, because of the posture. The way a man sat when he had been in one position long enough that sitting had become an act of endurance rather than rest. Hands behind him, head forward, the particular slope of shoulders that had been carrying something heavy for too long. He was alive. Jack could see the movement of breathing even from here, but alive was doing a lot of work as a description. Standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at Harper with his hands in the pockets of a canvas jacket and his feet apart on the concrete, was a man Jack had not seen in 12 years. Mick Donovan was 53 years old. He had been a large man when Jack knew him, and he was still a large man, the kind of large that had settled and compressed with age into something denser than it had started as. His hair was shorter now, close-cropped where it used to be longer, and the burn scar on the left side of his neck was visible even from here. That particular territory of skin that had gone smooth and tight and slightly wrong in color, running from below the jaw to the collarbone, the map of the night that had ended one way for Donovan and a different way for the man he'd spent the years since trying to reach. He was talking to Harper. Jack couldn't hear through the safety glass. He watched Donovan's mouth move, unhurried, the cadence of someone making a point they'd made before and intended to make again. Harper's head did not come up. To Donovan's left, one of the men Priest's contact had identified. Eddie Craw. 26 years old, patched in with a unanimous vote, 2 years inside. He was standing slightly behind Donovan, and he was watching Harper with his arms crossed and his jaw set. And Jack looked at the set of that jaw and found something there that he had not expected to find. Not pleasure, not the flat effect of a man doing a job. Something more complicated. Something that looked, from behind scratched safety glass in a lit bay, like it was costing Eddie Craw something to be where he was standing. Jack filed that. Did not draw conclusions from it. Filed it. He moved out of the office and back into the bay through the interior door, which was unlocked on both sides. The door opened quietly, and he came through it, and the change in the air told him he was in the bay before his eyes adjusted to the different quality of light. Donovan heard the door. He turned before Jack was fully in the room, which meant his senses were still good at 53, which Jack had expected. The man Jack remembered had always been the kind of man who heard things before they announced themselves. For a moment they were simply looking at each other across 40 feet of concrete floor and work light and 12 years of accumulated geometry. Donovan's face did several things in rapid sequence: recognition, confirmation, and underneath those something that Jack read as satisfaction, the satisfaction of an architecture producing exactly the outcome it was designed for. He thought he'd won. He still thought he'd won, even now, even with Jack already inside, because he hadn't yet recalculated for everything he didn't know. "Jack Morgan," Donovan said. His voice was the same. Deeper, maybe. But the texture of it was the same. The voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that volume was a display of uncertainty and quiet was a display of control. "Mick," Jack said. Eddie Craw had moved 2 steps to the left, repositioning, putting himself at an angle that wasn't directly between them. Jack clocked this and did not look at it. "You came alone," Donovan said. He was looking past Jack at the door he'd come through, assessing. "Does it matter?" Jack said. "It matters for what comes next," Donovan said. "If you came alone, then this ends one way. If you didn't—" He stopped, tilted his head slightly. "I've got 10 men outside." "I know." Something moved in Donovan's face, the satisfaction recalibrating. "Then you know how this goes." "I know how you think it goes," Jack said. He crossed the floor without hurrying, moving toward the lift pit, and Donovan turned to track him, and Eddie Craw moved again, that lateral adjustment that kept putting him at an angle Jack didn't fully have his eyes on. Jack stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down at Daniel Harper. Harper looked up. He was maybe 35 years old, dark-haired, with a face that had been good-looking before 3 days in a pit had worked on it. His left eye was swollen. There was dried blood on his chin from something that had happened to his mouth. He was wearing a canvas jacket that was inadequate for the temperature in the building, and his hands were zip-tied behind him with the particular efficiency of people who knew how to restrain someone for duration rather than transport. He looked at Jack, and his eyes did the thing that eyes did when a person was past the point of expecting rescue, and someone appeared to rescue them anyway. The refusal to believe it until there was more evidence. "You Jack Morgan," Harper said. His voice was rough with dehydration, and the words cost him something. "Yeah," Jack said. "Lily—" "Safe," Jack said. "Sarah, too." Daniel Harper's face did what faces did when the one thing they'd been holding out for arrived. It did not look like relief. It looked like a wall coming down, and walls coming down was not always a peaceful thing. "Touching," Donovan said. "I mean that. I always liked the reunion part." Jack turned to look at him. Donovan was not where he had been. He had moved during the exchange with Harper, taken 5 steps to the right, positioning himself between Jack and the interior office door, also between Jack and the most direct path to the exterior. Jack recalculated the room and did not show that he was recalculating. 12 years, Donovan said. "You've been sitting up in those Cedar Hills for 4 years, and the 8 years before that you were just gone. Disappeared like smoke." He looked at Jack with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was something older and more specific. "You saved my life. You know that's what started all this." "I know," Jack said. "You saved it, and then you acted like I should be grateful." His voice was still quiet, still controlled, like I should send you a card every year. "I didn't want anything from you." "That's the thing." Donovan pointed at him, a short, precise gesture. "That's exactly the thing. You saved my life, and you wanted nothing. You did it like it was nothing, like I was nothing. He stopped. His jaw worked once. That's not how it works. That's not how anything works. You put a man in your debt, and then you don't collect. You're not being generous. You're telling him he wasn't worth the trouble of collecting. Jack looked at him. The room was very quiet around this exchange. The work lamps threw their hard shadows. The cold in the building was the patient cold of an unheated space that had been letting winter in through every seam. Outside, 10 men who didn't know yet what was happening inside. You spent 12 years on this, Jack said, because you thought I disrespected you. I spent 12 years on this, Donovan said, because I decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life being the man you saved. The exterior vehicle door moved. Not opened, moved. The kind of movement that came from a heavy door being struck from the outside, once, with intent. Then a second sound, closer, from the north wall, and then, underneath all of it, rising, the sound of motorcycles, not one, not the careful single-engine murmur of approach, but multiple engines finding their registers simultaneously, from the north and the east. And the night outside the building suddenly had more noise in it than 10 perimeter guards could account for. Reuben had made calls this morning. 7 men total, he had said. 7 men minus Jack, Reuben, Calvin, Priest. 3 men still unaccounted for. 3 men who had apparently been positioned outside the Carver salvage yard since before Jack and the others arrived, waiting for a signal that had just been given. Donovan's face changed for the first time. You didn't come alone, he said. No, Jack said. The vehicle door came up on its tracks with a crash that shook the building, and through it came cold air and the sound of voices and the specific kind of controlled chaos that happened when trained men moved into a space simultaneously from multiple directions. Donovan turned toward the door, and Jack moved, crossed the floor in the time it took Donovan to register the turn, and went over the edge of the pit and dropped to the concrete beside Daniel Harper. Can you stand? Jack said. My hands. Jack had the zip ties off in 4 seconds with the blade from his boot, the same blade that had been in the same place for 9 years, and he pulled Harper upright by the arm, and Harper's legs did the thing legs did after extended constraint. They held, but barely, the joints slow to remember their purpose. Lean, Jack said, and Harper leaned, and Jack took his weight, and they came up over the edge of the pit together, Harper's arm across Jack's shoulders, and the bay was full of sound and motion, and men he recognized moving against men he didn't, and the work lamps were still burning their indifferent white across all of it. Eddie Craw had not moved. He was standing at the position he'd drifted to during the conversation, 6 feet from the pit, and he was looking at Jack and Harper with an expression that had resolved itself into something Jack hadn't expected to find in this room tonight. He was holding his hands at his sides, open, not reaching for anything. His face was doing the thing faces did when a decision had been made, and the making of it had cost more than the decision was worth. Get him out, Eddie Craw said. Jack looked at him. The north door, Craw said. His voice was stripped down to something very basic. I made sure it was clear. Get him out. Jack held the look for one more second. He did not have time for the full accounting this moment required. The full accounting was going to have to wait for a conversation that might happen and might not, in a future that was not yet guaranteed. Why? Jack said. Because I made a mistake, Craw said, and I can't take it back. But I can do this. The bay was in full motion around them. Donovan was somewhere in the noise, his voice rising now, the controlled quiet finally breaking under the pressure of a situation that had stopped going the way it was designed. Calvin was visible near the east wall, moving with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had assessed the room and was working through it systematically. Priest was not visible, and that was appropriate because Priest was never visible when it mattered. Jack moved. He took Harper's weight and went for the north door at the pace Harper's legs could manage, which was faster than it should have been, which said something about what Daniel Harper was made of. They hit the door, and it came open, and the cold outside hit them both like a flat hand, and the noise of the yard was different out here. The motorcycle engines, voices, the sound of a situation being contested. But the path along the north fence was clear. Reuben appeared from the dark. He took Harper's other arm without a word, and his face when he looked at Daniel Harper was the face of a man who was working very hard to keep several things separate that wanted to be simultaneous. He looked at Jack over Harper's head, and Jack looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. They moved along the fence toward the east gap. Behind them, inside the building, there was a single shout that Jack recognized as Donovan's voice, carrying over all the other sound. Not commanding, not controlling. Something rawer than that. The voice of a man watching an architecture he had spent 18 months building come apart in real time, and finding that the sound it made was not what he had imagined. Reuben got Harper through the east gap first, and the fence caught on Harper's jacket the same way it had caught on Jack's vest, and Reuben worked it free with the specific patience of a man who had been working things free his whole life. And then Harper was through, and Reuben was through, and Jack was coming through last, when the second exterior vehicle door came up on the south end of the yard, and the light from inside threw a shape across the frozen ground. Donovan. Coming through the open door. Alone. His crew was occupied and he was coming out himself, which said something about where the 12 years of architecture had finally arrived. Not to a machine that ran on its own, but to a man who still, at the bottom of everything, needed to do this himself. He was looking for Jack. He found him at the fence. They were 30 yards apart in the amber-lit yard and the cold and the noise. Donovan had nothing in his hands. Jack noticed that. No weapon drawn. Just the man himself, standing in the open door of the bay, with the white light behind him and the cold dark in front, looking across the yard at Jack Morgan with an expression that had stopped being about 12 years ago, or salvage yards, or documents, or machines, and had arrived, stripped of all its architecture, at the thing it had always been about. Two men who had stood in the same place once, and chosen differently. Jack held the look across 30 yards of frozen ground. Then he turned and went through the fence. He heard Donovan behind him, heard him moving across the yard, not running, walking, with the particular pace of a man who has decided something about what comes next and intends to see it through regardless of what the logistics suggest. Jack came through this fence and straightened and looked back through the chain link. Donovan stopped at the fence, 6 inches of chain link between them. His face was right there, close enough to read every line of it. And what Jack read was not the architecture of 12 years, not the machine, not the obsession. What he read was something that had been underneath all of it, something that the 12 years of building had been designed to cover because the real thing was too small and too human and too unsalvageable to look at directly. Donovan was a man who had been saved by someone who didn't need anything from him and had spent 12 years trying to prove that the saving was a mistake. "You can't walk away from this," Donovan said. His voice was different now. The quiet was still there, but it was a different kind of quiet, worn through. "I'm not walking away," Jack said. "I'm walking Harper out. That's not Mick." Jack's voice came out different too. Not hard, not cold. The voice he used when he was saying something true that he had not planned to say. "You spent 12 years on this. You built a machine. You compromised people. You killed Garrett Fossey. You put a 5-year-old in a barn in November." He looked at the man through the chain link. "And you're standing here at a fence with nothing left in your hands. What did it get you?" Donovan's jaw worked. "What did it get you?" Jack said again. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction. The honest question. The answer was on Donovan's face. The answer was in the way he was standing, in the way the chain link was between them, and neither of them had chosen that arrangement. It had simply become the arrangement, the fence that was always there waiting to be the boundary between what a man became and what he could have been. Behind Jack, Reuben had Harper moving. The sound of motorcycles repositioning, engines adjusting, men concluding something and preparing to move. The yard was going quiet in the way things went quiet when the main force of something had spent itself. Jack turned from the fence. He walked toward where Reuben had Harper upright between 2 other men, and he heard behind him the sound of Donovan's hand hitting the chain link once, not throwing himself at it, not trying to get through, just the flat contact of a palm against metal, a sound that was the last gesture of something that had used itself up. Calvin appeared at Jack's right shoulder. "We need to move," he said, low, efficient. "The county sheriff, one of the compromised ones. There's a call going out." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Jack looked at Daniel Harper. Harper looked back at him. Up close, the damage was more specific than it had been from the pit. The eye was worse. The split in his lip was deep, and there was something in the way he was holding his left side that suggested a rib that had been asked to do too much. But his eyes were clear. Whatever had been done to him had not reached the part of him that was still deciding. "There's a place," Jack said, 14 miles east. Secure. Can you ride?" Harper looked at the motorcycles. "I've never been on a—" "With me," Jack said. "Same as your daughter." Something moved through Daniel Harper's face at the word daughter. Moved through it and kept moving, the way large things move through people when the structure holding them steady finally got the news that it could let go. "Yeah," Harper said. "I can ride." Jack looked around the yard. Through the chain link, Donovan had not moved from the fence. His crew was dispersed, some detained, some fled, the machine taking on the particular shape that machines took when the main pressure source was removed. Inside the bay, there were sounds of conclusion. Priest materialized from the space between two car stacks, unhurried, his canvas jacket carrying a new tear along the left shoulder that had not been there before. He looked at Jack, and Jack looked at him, and Priest's face said what it said, which was that everything inside the building had been handled to the extent it needed to be handled, and the extent that was appropriate. "Eddie Craw," Jack said. Priest looked at him. "Where is he?" A pause. "Gone," Priest said. "North fence, before the south door opened." He was already moving. Jack thought about the open hands, the specific neutrality of the position. "I made a mistake, and I can't take it back." He thought about all the different reasons a man might stand inside a thing he regretted and choose the one moment he could to make the cost of it count for something. He thought about all of that and filed it in the place where things went that required a longer accounting than the immediate situation allowed. "Let's go," he said. They moved to the bikes. 7 men and 1 civilian, Daniel Harper steadied between Reuben and Calvin, the cold coming hard now off the open ground beyond the yard. Jack brought his bike upright and started the engine, and the sound of it rose into the November dark, steady and certain, the voice he had relied on through more nights than he had names for. Harper settled behind him and put his hands on Jack's jacket the way Lily had held his arm, a grip that was not asking for anything except to hold on, which was enough, which had always been enough. Jack looked at the salvage yard one final time. Donovan was still at the fence. The amber work lights were still burning. The shape of the man through the chain link was still and upright and alone in the lit yard, and the 12 years and the machine and the architecture of it were all somewhere in that shape, alongside everything else the shape contained. The night he'd been saved, the debt he'd refused, the choice that had compounded into this. Jack put his bike in gear. The others moved with him, finding their places in the formation with the unspoken coordination of men who had been through enough together that formation was instinct rather than arrangement. 7 engines on the county road, heading east, their lights cutting the dark in a line that the dark simply had to accommodate. 3 miles out, Harper said something against Jack's shoulder. The wind in the engine took most of it, but the word that came through was "thank you," and Jack nodded once into the cold air because there was nothing to say to thank you in this particular moment that wasn't smaller than the moment itself. The road ran out ahead of them, pale and empty, and leading toward a safe house in the Cedar Hills, where a 5-year-old had organized a deck of cards on the floor and said, "Come back," rather than try, because she had understood already the difference between an honest answer and the answer that was required. Behind them, in a salvage yard outside Weston County, Mick Donovan stood at a chain-link fence in the amber light and looked at the place where Jack Morgan's taillights had been, and the county sheriff's radio crackled somewhere in the dark, and the machine he had built was coming apart at every seam, and the thing he had wanted 12 years to deliver him from was still. They rode through the last of the November dark, with the cold coming in off the fields like something that had been waiting its turn. Harper held on. That was all he did, and it was enough. His hands gripped Jack's jacket, and his weight shifted with the bike the way a person's weight shifted when they had stopped fighting what was carrying them and had simply decided to let it carry them. 7 miles out from the salvage yard, his grip loosened slightly, not from exhaustion, but from something releasing that had been held tight for a very long time, and Jack felt the change and said nothing about it and rode. The Cedar Hills came up gray and familiar in the headlights. The private road. The two big cedars with the porch light burning amber, exactly as he had left it. Reuben's truck was already there. It had come from the east, from wherever Reuben had arranged for the overnight safe location that Lily and Sarah Harper had been taken to, and it was parked beside the porch with its engine still ticking cool, and Reuben was coming out the front door when the bikes came up the road, and behind Reuben was a woman Jack had not yet seen in person. Sarah Harper was 32 years old, and she had dark hair and the particular posture of someone who had been holding a structure together by force of will alone for long enough that the posture had become permanent. She came through the front door behind Reuben and stopped on the porch and looked at the bikes coming up the road, and her face did the thing that Harper's face had done in the pit, the wall coming down. Harper was off the bike before Jack had it fully stopped, moving on legs that were still working through their recollection of how to work. And he crossed the yard and went up the porch steps, and Sarah Harper came down them, and they met at the bottom in the particular way of two people who had rehearsed this reunion in the worst possible mental circumstances and were now discovering that the actual thing was both smaller and much larger than the rehearsal. Jack stayed on his bike for a moment, let the engine idle, looked at the porch, and looked at the two of them, and then looked at the cedar trees and the sky, which was beginning to do the thing November skies did in the hour before dawn. Not lighter exactly, but less committed to darkness, the black shading toward something that hadn't decided yet. He cut the engine. Lily appeared in the doorway. She was wearing the borrowed socks and the hoodie and the flannel shirt, and she was holding the stuffed rabbit that Reuben must have retrieved from somewhere in the process of the night. And she stood in the doorway and looked at the yard with her composed, assessing eyes, and found her father on the porch steps and her mother standing and the two of them together, and she stood very still for exactly 1 second. Then she went down the steps at the speed that only 5-year-olds and people with nothing left to lose could manage, and Daniel Harper turned and caught her, and came up with her in his arms, and his face pressed against her hair, and Sarah Harper put both arms around both of them, and the three of them stood in the amber porch light in the cold November yard, and Jack Morgan looked at his hands on the handlebars of his bike and breathed. Calvin came up beside him and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the porch. "Ribs cracked," Calvin said. "About Harper." "Maybe 2. "I know. He needs a doctor." "I know a guy in Cloverfield who doesn't ask the kind of questions that cause problems," Jack said. "I'll call him at 6. Calvin nodded. They stood together in the cold and the quiet, 2 men watching a family hold itself together on a porch. And neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing to say that the sight of it wasn't already saying better. Priest came and stood on Jack's other side. The tear in his jacket was longer in the light than it had seemed in the yard. He was going to need stitches along the left forearm where something had opened him, not deep, but open. He had said nothing about it and clearly did not intend to unless pressed. Jack noted it and did not press. Reuben came down from the porch and crossed the yard to where the 3 of them were standing. He stopped and looked at Jack, and Jack looked at him, and the night they had both just come through was in both their faces, the weight of it settling now that the velocity had stopped. "Wade," Jack said. Reuben's jaw tightened. "He's been dealt with." "How?" "He's alive," Reuben said. "He'll stay that way." He paused. "He's also going to want to be somewhere that isn't this county for a very long time." Another pause. "He told me who approached him, when, what they offered." He looked at the ground. "He's not a bad man, Jack. He's a frightened one. Donovan's machine got to him early, and the leverage was the kind you can't easily refuse." Jack thought about Wade Curran and thought about what Donovan had said about leverage and power, and decided that the full accounting of that situation was going to happen in a separate conversation in daylight with Reuben and nobody else. There were gradations between betrayal and bad luck, an impossible circumstance that deserved more careful examination than the middle of a cold November morning on the yard of a Cedar Hills safe house could provide. "And Donovan," Jack said. Reuben looked up. "County sheriff is compromised, but only one of the 2. The other one isn't." He paused. "Priest made a call from the yard." Jack looked at Priest. "The documentation Harper copied," Priest said. "He told us where one set of it was during the ride. A location in Cloverfield." He met Jack's eyes. "I made a call to the right person. The documentation is in the right hands now." A pause, measured and precise. Donovan's machine runs on paper. You take the paper away, the machine stops. Another pause. It stopped. Jack thought about 12 years of architecture, about shell companies and compromised officials and a salvage yard and a burn scar and a chain-link fence. He thought about the sound of a palm hitting metal in the dark. "He'll walk away from the yard tonight," Jack said. "Maybe," Priest said. "Not from what the documentation starts." His voice was doing what it did, delivering the necessary thing without apology. He made choices, Jack. For 12 years he made choices. The weight of them is his. Jack looked at the porch, at the Harper family in the amber light, at the door of the safe house standing open and warm behind them, light spilling out onto the boards. He thought about Lily saying Ruth was brave. He thought about Garrett Fossey, who had helped hide a family and paid for it, who had known Jack in a specific time and place, and had made a different kind of choice about what to do with what he knew, and who was gone now, and whose goneness was one of the permanent costs of the night that could not be recouped. He did not say anything about Garrett Foss. He said it in the place where things went that you carried rather than resolved, and he understood that carrying it was the appropriate response, and he would carry it, because that was what the weight was for. Reuben put his hand on Jack's shoulder again. The same hand, the same shoulder, the same gesture as before, but different now in the way that identical gestures were different when everything around them had changed. "Come inside," Reuben said. "It's cold." They went inside. The safe house was full in a way it had never been in Jack's experience of it. The kitchen table had more people around it than it had chairs for, and someone had put coffee on, and the front room had the quality of a place that had been used for emergency shelter and was now transitioning into something else, something that was still figuring out its name. Daniel Harper was in the chair by the fire with his shirt raised while Jack made the assessment he'd learned from a field medic in a country that didn't exist on any of the maps hanging on his walls. And the cracked ribs were too, both left side, and he taped them with the supplies from the kit and told Harper not to laugh for 6 weeks. Harper looked up at him from the chair. "She talked about you, son," he said. "Lily." Jack put the tape away. "She talked much in general." "No," Harper said, "which is why." Jack looked at him. She told Reuben when they were driving that she left the key on the nightstand because you were going to come back and you'd need to lock up." Harper's voice was rough and quiet and carrying more than one thing at once. "Said you were too careful to leave a door unlocked." Jack thought about a key on a nightstand, about a 5-year-old who had prepared for his return in the specific practical language of someone who expressed faith through action rather than declaration. "Your wife and daughter need to stay somewhere off the grid for a few more weeks," Jack said, "until the documentation completes what it started. Reuben knows a place. You go with them. And when it's done?" "When it's done, you go wherever you want." Jack paused. "You've got the documentation secured now. Once the right people finish with it, the leverage Donovan held over everyone who helped him, it's finished. You go back to whatever life you were building." Harper was quiet for a moment. The fire made its sounds. From the kitchen, Lily's voice asking Sarah something about whether there was honey, and Sarah's voice answering, and the ordinary domestic texture of that exchange was so precisely the opposite of everything the night had been that it sat in the room like a different kind of weight. "The man in that yard," Harper said, "Donovan. He was choosing the words carefully, the way a man chose words when he had spent 3 days in a pit thinking about the shape of things. He wanted to destroy you." "Yeah," Jack said, "because you saved him." That's what he said. Harper looked at the fire. "He's the only person I've ever heard of who turned being saved into a reason to hate someone." Jack thought about the chain-link fence, about the palm hitting the metal, about the expression on Donovan's face when the architecture finished collapsing. "Some men can't stand being in someone's debt," Jack said. "And some men can't stand that the debt doesn't matter to the person they owe it to." He paused. "I didn't save him because I wanted something. I saved him because not saving him would have made me something I didn't want to be." He stood up from his crouch beside the chair. "He spent 12 years trying to make it about him. It was always about me." Harper looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," Harper said. For the second time, but different now. Not the reflexive gratitude of a man who had just survived something, but the considered gratitude of a man who had had a minute to understand what he was thanking someone for. "For her," he said. "Whatever she told you and whatever you did with it." Jack picked up the first aid kit and didn't answer that directly because the answer was standing in the kitchen asking about Honey, and it didn't need to be translated. The doctor from Cloverfield arrived at 6:15. He was a man in his 60s who carried his bag like it was familiar weight and looked at the assembled group in the safe house kitchen with the eyes of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a man in his position could do was treat what was in front of him and ask no questions about how it got there. He looked at Harper's ribs and at Priest's forearm and at Calvin's hand, which turned out to have 2 fingers that had been dislocated and reset in the field and needed better attention than the field had provided. And he worked quietly and completely and drank the coffee someone put in front of him and left before 7 with an envelope that Jack handed him at the door, and a nod that covered everything they had both decided not to say. By 8 o'clock, the Harper family was in Reuben's truck. Lily was in the back seat with the stuffed rabbit and a box of crackers that Sarah had found in the kitchen cabinet and the deck of cards, which she had collected from the coffee table and placed in her jacket pocket with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Jack stood at the driver's side window. Reuben was behind the wheel. In the back seat, through the window, Lily was looking at him. He went around to the back door and opened it. She looked up at him from the crackers and the rabbit. Her face was the composed, assessing face, but underneath the composure today there was something that hadn't been there before, something that was the color and texture of a child who had been cold for a long time and was beginning to believe the warmth was going to stay. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. You said you'd try." "I tried hard enough," he said. She looked at him. Something worked in her face. Then she held out the deck of cards. He looked at it. "For when it gets too quiet," she said, "you can do the suits yourself. It takes a while. That's the point." Jack took the deck of cards from her hand. It fit in his palm exactly the way her hand had fit around 2 of his fingers in the barn on Route 9, which was to say, it did not fit at all and fit completely. "Lily," he said. "Yeah." "Your grandmother, Ruth." He paused. "She did the right thing." Lily looked at him. Her eyes did something he had learned to recognize over the course of 4 days as the thing they did when she was holding something that was both painful and true, and had decided that holding it upright was better than putting it down. "I know," she said. "I'm going to remember her like that." He nodded. He closed the truck door. He stepped back and watched Reuben take the truck down the private road through the cedar trees, and the red taillights moved through the dappled morning light and got smaller and went around the first curve and were gone. The sound of the engine faded. The cedar trees settled back into their silence. Calvin and Priest were on their bikes already. Calvin looked at Jack across the yard. "You all right?" Calvin said. Jack looked at the empty road where the truck had been, at the cedar trees going about their business in the early light, at the safe house with its porch light still burning amber against a morning that was finally deciding to be morning, thin winter sunlight coming through the clouds in the specific way of a day that was going to be cold and clear. He was 54 things at once, none of which had a clean name. He was the man who had ridden Route 9 at 9 degrees looking for quiet and found something that was the opposite of quiet and had turned out to be the opposite of nothing. He was the man standing in the yard of a house that had felt like an ending for 4 years and felt, this particular morning, like it might be something else. He was a man holding a deck of cards. "Yeah," Jack Morgan said. "I'm all right." He put the cards in the inside pocket of his leather vest, against his chest, where they settled with the particular weight of something that was small and mattered anyway, and he went to his bike, and he started the engine, and the sound of it rose into the cedar hills and the cold morning air like a voice that had been silent too long and had finally remembered what it was for. He did not ride away. He sat in the yard for a long moment with the engine running and the morning light coming down through the trees, and he listened to the sound his house made in the wind, and for the first time in a very long time, the sound of it was not empty. Then he turned the bike around and went back to the porch and cut the engine and went inside and put the coffee on for himself and sat at the kitchen table in the silence that was no longer the wrong kind of silence and looked at the morning through the window and let it be what it was. Outside, the road was empty and the cedar trees were still. The scars remained, but the house, finally, was home. End.